Yeah, thank you very much. It's if you're 7 lectures into a course on ecological intensification, then everybody probably knows more than I do on ecological intensification. But yeah, that sounds like you've had some really good background. So today I'm going to give a series of lectures which really focus on pollination as a component of ecological intensification and its important role in crop production. So I have some slides. I shall try and share these. So please let me know if it works. Okay.
Yeah.
Please let me know if that's worked and it's on.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so ecological intensification, managing pollinators in agroecosystems. So just a very conceptual figure of what ecological intensification potentially represents, or at least represents from my context. And it's obviously it's not a new idea, but it's around focusing research and management around biodiversity, and particularly functional biodiversity in agroecosystems, whether this is natural enemies, pollinators, a below ground biodiversity delivering important ecosystem services, nutrient cycling, degradation, while simultaneously reducing reliance on more unsustainable conventional inputs, typically synthetic fertilizers and pesticides as well. So ecological intensification is about harnessing that biodiversity to deliver benefits to crop yield and also minimize externalities, so negative impacts on the wider environment. Now, pollination is just one component of that ecological intensification. It's one component of that functional biodiversity that delivers an important service and underpins crop production for a number of different crops. So it's on this I would like to focus the talks today. So the plan for the session is I'll give a lecture giving a bit of an introduction of what crop pollination is and its potential value, and then talk about some work we've been doing in the UK, looking at better understanding pollinators and pollination. And I think we'll have a break, and then we'll hear a presentation from Camilla on an important paper that's very well cited, talking about the value of pollinators. Then there will be, I'd like to give a second talk on pollinator community ecology and how important that is for crop pollination. And then finally, a third session where I'd like to present some examples of how pollinators could be managed in agroecosystems to deliver better pollination or more resilient pollination. So I will kick off with the introductory lecture. And I guess you know what pollination is now. It's effectively the movement of pollen between the male and female parts of flowers. And it's important for reproduction in over 80% of plant species, but that includes a number of crops. And of course, there's wind pollination, self-pollination, but actually the majority of pollination is carried out by animals. Animals are the vectors of those pollen. So when it comes to crops, here's an example of a globally important crop. This is an apple flower, and it's being visited by a wild ground nesting solitary andrenid bee. And we've worked on apple pollination a lot at the University of Reading. And this is a photo taken from some of our field work. And here you can see this bee has landed on the apple flower, and it's collecting nectar and pollen from that flower. And as it moves around the orchard, visiting flower after flower, it carries out that pollination. And that pollination is essential to get fruit set and production in those apple orchards. So these wild bees are really important for pollinating apples in this system. You can see the pollen on its body there, and it's inadvertently moving that pollen around between flowers and carrying out that pollination. So how important in a broader context is pollination? We'll hear a bit more about this from the presentation from Camilla. But a kind of bottom line is around 3/4 of crops being grown globally depend to some extent on animal pollination. Some are highly dependent and you get very little crop without them. Some are not very dependent, but animal pollinators make a small contribution to yield or quality of those crops. So the majority of crops grown globally depend to some extent on pollinators. But it's important to note it doesn't necessarily include many of the staple crops that we consume: rice, potatoes, wheat, maize. These don't depend on animal pollinators. But it's those crops, those fruits and vegetables that are really important sources of vitamins and minerals to allow us to maintain a healthy diet that are particularly dependent on animal pollinators. So in terms of bulk, the vast majority of food isn't dependent on animal pollinators, but that's stuff that provides important health benefits and maintains healthy diets for humans. That the majority of those crops depend on pollinators. But there's also a number of other important commodity crops and cash crops that depend on insect pollinators, including coffee, and of course, cocoa for chocolate. And if you start to estimate the global value of insect pollination to agriculture, then you get estimates between $200 and $600 billion per year. I mean, it's huge amounts in terms of the economic value of this ecosystem service that's delivered by pollinators, underpinning agriculture. Interestingly, if you look where this agricultural dependence on animal pollination is distributed across the globe, you can see it's definitely not uniform. And some parts of the world where certain crops are grown, the proportion of agriculture is much more dependent on animal pollination. So those countries in red and orange have an agricultural sector that's more dependent on animal pollinators compared to those in the pale yellows. And that's because they grow crops that are highly dependent on animal pollinators. But this graph, these figures also show how that level of dependence has changed from the 1960s up to the 2000s. And our dependence on animal pollination has increased over this time. And that's because the number of animal pollinated crops that are being grown is increasing. You'll notice Chile on this figure is relative to its neighbors and relative to much of the world is dependent, highly dependent on animal pollinators relative to other regions, again, because of the crops that it grows and exports and consumes. So what's carrying out this animal pollination across these agroecosystems? Well, there's a huge diversity of animals that visit flowers, and any of these can potentially move pollen and carry out that pollination. But the vast majority is insects. And of these insects, a high proportion of that pollination is carried out by bees. But in many parts of the world, not the UK, unfortunately, but other places, you've got birds and mammals, even reptiles, which carry out pollination of some plants. But the vast majority is insects. And of the bees, which are an important group of those insects, there's a number of managed species, of course, Apis mellifera, the honeybee, but a number of bumblebee species now are mass produced for pollination, and stingless bees as well. But again, the majority of pollinator species that pollinate crops around the world are wild insect pollinators. I'm sure you've heard on the news as well. We always get it in the news in the UK too. The public are interested in it, and there's a lot of alarmist headlines out about the decline of pollinators, the loss of bees, honeybees, for example, or other pollinators, the decline of insects. So it's high on the kind of political and public agenda, which is a really good thing. But there's still a lot we don't know about the current status of bees.
Yes, hello. Yes, Mike, I was curious about maybe if you know there's some information about interactions between these pollinators, for example, the osmia bees or the hoverflies that can enhance pollination, because I don't know, I was thinking about this interaction between Bombus terrestris and Apis mellifera, that they made these holes in the base of the flowers to store the nectar. But maybe I have seen, for example, in the field, close flowers that maybe smaller insects like other species of bees can open, that Apis mellifera can open, and maybe after that they can go inside the flower and carry pollen and make the pollination. But I don't know if you know if there's like these kind of interactions between pollinators can have some effect on the yield and the pollination in general. I mean, sorry, I was trying to figure out a way to express what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I understand the question. No, it's interesting. Yeah, so I'm not aware of a situation where, but it may happen, a situation where a pollinator perhaps enters a flower and then makes that flower more available to other pollinators by opening the flower potentially and making it. I could imagine that might happen if you have a big pollinator like a bumblebee that lands on a bean flower and visits it many times, then that flower may become more accessible for lighter pollinators to exploit. So I can imagine that might happen, but I don't know of any evidence of that happening. But there is evidence of other interactions between pollinators on crop flowers. And sometimes, I think it's honeybees or bumblebees, when they're visiting flowers, will often disturb other flower visitors on those flowers and cause them to move to another flower. So there's actually evidence showing that by having different kind of pollinators in the system, you actually cause pollinators to move more regularly between flowers and between trees and between rows. And actually this is potentially beneficial for crop pollination, because that movement between flowers is critical for that pollination. So there is that example of facilitation between different pollinators in a system, and potential added value of having different species pollinating flowers in a system. But there's also evidence of emerging as a recent study, again from apple orchards, showing that when you have high numbers of honeybees in a system, then the richness and abundance of wild pollinators is reduced in that system. And actually, honeybees are an important driver reducing the abundance and richness of wild pollinators visiting flowers. And there could be many reasons for this. It's possibly because they're exploiting the floral resource, maybe removing the nectar and monopolizing that floral resource, so other pollinators go elsewhere. And so that's in an antagonistic relationship. So there's some facilitation between pollinators, but also some antagonism as well, with evidence emerging that honeybees may be displacing other wild pollinators. But yeah, really, really good idea. It'd be interesting to look at further.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Probably we should go with the second part, Mike, and in next probably more question will be in the next second or third part of your talk.
Yeah, no problem. So shall I give my lectures and then the student presentation at the end? Is that the best thing to do?
Oh, I don't know how Carlo organized this. Carlo, it's okay for you?
Yeah, it's up to you, Mike. Yeah. You can manage the lecture as you want.
Okay.
We should, in some part, do a small break. Okay.
And also consider, Mike, the presentation of one student, right?
Yeah, Camila's presentation.
Yeah. Okay. So what we could do then is perhaps I'll do the second part of the presentation now. Then maybe we have a break and then come back and have the student's presentation before I give the final presentation at the end. Is that okay, Carlos?
Yeah, fine. Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'll give the second part of the talk, which is a bit shorter now, and then we can break afterwards. Great, if everybody's happy. Okay, share screen. So now I want to talk. We've spoken a bit about the potential role of pollinators in crop systems and the contribution they make to crop pollination, and we've talked about different pollinators that we find in different crops and how effective they are as pollinators. Now I want to give a talk on recent research looking at pollinator community ecology and how the community of pollinators found in a crop system influences the pollination that they provide that crop. So as we've talked about, we know agriculture faces a number of challenges. And in terms of pollinators delivering an ecosystem service to crop production, agricultural intensification is a driver that's reducing the availability of wild pollinators to pollinate crops. And this is through inputs like fertilizers and pesticides having direct effects on pollinators, but also loss of natural habitats or semi-natural habitats in agricultural systems. And these natural or semi-natural habitats are really important in agroecosystems because they provide nesting sites and they provide additional floral resources for pollinators to exploit. So pollen and nectar is available throughout the foraging period of pollinators to allow them to thrive and reproduce and persist in the landscape. So there's loads of evidence showing the important role of natural habitats in and semi-natural habitats in agroecosystems for supporting pollinators. And we can contrast several landscapes here. Here's an example. We've got what you might call a natural habit ecosystem, and a very intensive, disturbed ecosystem here where there's very little nesting opportunity, very few floral resources for pollinators. There's almost no way a pollinator could exist in that intensive agricultural system. But then there are intermediate agroecosystems as well. So this one at the bottom is a very diverse production system. So crops are still produced in this system, but many different kinds of crops. And then semi-natural or natural areas are also maintained within this agroecosystem. So by having lots of different crops being produced in a system, there's the opportunity to provide additional floral resources and pollen and nectar for pollinators throughout the season. And then, of course, by having areas that are not cropped, where the soil isn't disturbed, such as natural areas, then these provide important nesting sites for pollinators as well. And it was a really interesting question we just had about how important natural or semi-natural areas are in supporting pollinators in the UK. There is evidence that they are important in the UK, but also taking large-scale meta-analyses, taking data from all over the world, and this is a study by Lucas Garibaldi, it shows that trend is consistent in most agroecosystems, that as you get further from natural areas, the abundance and activity of pollinators and resulting pollination is reduced. And that's a consistent trend across many different agricultural production systems, including the UK, including probably Chile also. So again, there's been a large-scale review exploring this that was published a couple of years ago. And this used data from all over the world, from different crop systems. And it looked at how the abundance and richness of pollinators and natural enemies in agroecosystems affected pollination or pest control and yield, and how this was affected by landscape context as well. And across this meta-analysis, the evidence shows that as species richness of either pollinators or natural enemies as well, as that species richness increases, so does that service which they provide, whether it's pollination or natural pest control. Species richness is important. So getting lots of different species in your system on average increases the delivery of that service. And then this figure on the right, what was shown across all these data sets was that as you increase the proportion of agriculture compared to non-agriculture around a crop field, so the richness of pollinators is reduced. So more crops, less semi-natural habitat means less species richness, which means less pollination, which means less production. So protecting those non-cropped semi-natural areas in agroecosystems is really important for maintaining that species richness and maintaining that pollination, and therefore production. So if we consider pollinator diversity, or in this case bee diversity, there's huge variability in the form and function of bees, which are important pollinators of many crops. We've got some examples here. Of course, we've got the world's biggest bee, which was thought to be extinct, but it was actually found again in Indonesia a few years ago, Wallace's giant bee. And the picture of there picture of it there is shown against a honeybee, so showing you how large this bee species is. The other example on the top right is stingless bees. And so these are very different. They produce very large colonies. Actually, they're now being exploited and used for commercial pollination of crops in many parts of the world. Another nice example is the bumblebee in the bottom left. Again, this is Bombus terrestris, a globally important pollinator of crops. But these are mostly found in cooler parts of the world, and therefore they are large and they have nice hairy bodies. And then another example, this is Lasia glossum, or a sweat bee. So these are really tiny bees. And this is one on the edge of a dandelion petal, which shows you how small they are. So this is just a demonstration of some of the diversity of bees. And this diversity is manifest in different physiologies and different behaviors, or traits, as they might be called. So you can divide these different physiologies and different behaviors into separate traits. And these traits are a feature of the pollinator or the bee species that has influences its capacity to deliver a service like pollination of crops, for example. So we could consider some physiological traits associated with pollinators and bees. Hairiness, top left, tongue length would be a physiological trait. So the hairiness, it would influence the amount of pollen they maybe carry between visits between flowers and how much they deposit. The tongue length will influence which flowers they maybe land on to extract nectar from. For example, those beans we've been talking about, usually you'll only have bees with very long tongues that will land on those bean flowers and do that pollination. And of course, size is an important physiological trait. If they're very small, they maybe don't come into contact with many parts of the flower, and therefore are not very effective pollinators as compared to a bigger pollinator. But there's a number of behavioral traits as well that influence the capacity of a species to do pollination. For example, when they're active in the day, they may be more active early in the day or late in the day, and that may influence how effective they are at pollinating different crops, avocados, for example. Also, the weather conditions in which they are active may be different for different species. Some species may be much less active in cool conditions or wet conditions, whereas other species may still be active and carry out that pollination in these conditions. And then their behavior on a flower. For example, they maybe land on a flower just to extract nectar. They'll land on, they'll just pinch the nectar and fly off, and they won't be effective pollinators compared to a pollinator that lands on the flower and collects pollen and nectar. That's part of their behavior that affects how well they may pollinate a crop. So these traits are important to consider when trying to understand the contribution of a pollinator community to pollination of a crop. And a nice example of this comes from a study carried out in California in almonds. And so this is a very intensive production system that's highly reliant on pollinators. Here you can see almond orchards in flower. There's very little other natural or semi-natural habitat around. So almond producers are really reliant on honeybees to carry out pollination. So they bring in many honeybee hives into the orchards during flowering to do that pollination. But there was a study carried out by Claire Britton in this system, and she looked at how visitation by different pollinators was affected by weather conditions. And so this figure shows the visitation of honeybees, but also other wild pollinators. So some of these almond orchards are closer to natural areas where you get a higher species richness of pollinators compared to other areas which are dominated by honeybees. But in the area where you find only honeybees visiting almond flowers, in high wind conditions, so the high and the low, and the top left-hand figure represents high wind and low wind. In high wind conditions, the honeybees no longer went out to forage on almonds, and they either remained on the hive or foraged somewhere else. And actually there was almost no visitation to almond flowers under high wind conditions. But if you consider the top right figure, in areas where there was a higher species richness and different wild pollinators in that system, even under high wind conditions, you still got visitation to those almond flowers from some groups of wild pollinators, which are still active in high wind conditions. Therefore, in in parts of the season or in seasons where environmental conditions are less good, say they're very windy, you still get that pollination delivered to the almond crops because you have a higher diversity and richness of pollinators with different behavioral traits in that pollinator community. If we consider the other figure, the two bottom figures, we're looking at where on the trees pollinators foraged. And it showed that predominantly honeybees were foraging on the top of almond trees with fewer visitation to almond flowers on the lower part of the trees. And certainly under high wind conditions, it dropped off completely. But in a system where there was wild pollinators and higher species richness, you still got visitation to all parts, excuse me, to all parts of the tree. So again, behaviorally, having that diversity of pollinators increases the visitation to flowers all over the trees and in suboptimal environmental conditions. So it shows an important value of getting that species richness and species with different traits in that agroecosystem. So this is another study where we've contributed a number of data sets to a large scale analysis that was done. And we provided data on pollinators and pollination in different systems, and also traits of those pollinators as well, how big they were, how hairy they were, and what their behavioral traits were. And across this analysis, it showed, as before, that as you increase species richness, so you increase pollination of crops, in this case, fruit set. This is this figure on the top left. So more species in a system means greater fruit sets of pollination. But likewise, more species in the system, unsurprisingly, means you get more different traits in the pollinator community, as well as highly positively correlated between the number of species in a pollinator community and the number of traits in that pollinator community. So increasing richness in a system increases that trait richness as well, and therefore you're likely to have pollinators that are behaviorally or physiologically adapted to pollinate crops in different conditions. So if we consider this, if we consider a trait like I don't know, tongue length, if you have a community of just 2 species, then the trait space in terms of tongue length that's covered by those two species, A and B, will be a certain amount. But if you increase additional species into that system, say species C and species D, the figure at the bottom, then the potential trait space covered for a trait like tongue length is increased. So more species is likely to increase the trait space covered by a pollinator community. And this is kind of a representation of the figure we just seen. So we were part of another study that was published a couple of years ago, carried out by Ben Woodcock. And here he took data, and this study focused on oilseed rape. And he took data from a number of different experiments carried out in Europe, the US, and China. And these experiments were carried out in flight cages, but also in open field conditions as well. And these experiments recorded the abundance of pollinators, the richness of pollinators, and also community traits of pollinators. And it was explored how these affected the yield of the oilseed rape in the system. And these are the results from that meta-analysis. So from the mesocosm studies, which is the top figure, as species richness and abundance was increased, so this was correlated with increased oilseed rape yield. But when we came to consider field studies, a number of different community metrics, community pollinator metrics were considered. And as expected, the more pollinators you have in a crop field of oilseed rape, the better pollination and the greater oilseed rape yield you get. So abundance was positively associated with oilseed rape yield. But then in terms of species richness, effects groups richness, body length, community weighted means, stigma contact, hairiness, phylogenetic relatedness, these things were not positively associated with yield, but the community characteristic that was most strongly associated with improving oilseed rape yield was functional divergence. I'll just talk about what functional divergence is in this system. So here we have two pollinator communities, the top row and the bottom row. And if we consider pollinator size, for example, in the first pollinator community, you have species A and B, and they're relatively similar in size. So you might argue that their capacity to pollinate a flower like oilseed rape might be similar. They have a similar physiology, a similar size. But then if you consider a second pollinator community, and this is a functionally divergent pollinator community, and this is where the species in that community express very different traits for a particular trait. So this would be a functionally divergent pollinator community. And this study showed that it was pollinator communities with species with very divergent traits actually delivered better pollination service to oilseed rape. And potentially that's having very big pollinators and very small pollinators in the pollinator community meant you get better pollination of that open oilseed rape flower. Or perhaps you have big pollinators that are active at different times to small pollinators. So their behavior is very different as well. And that results in improved pollination of the oilseed rape. So its functional divergence was an important community, a pollinator community determinant of pollination. So if we consider what the best pollinator community might be for pollinating a crop, of course you want high species richness, and those meta-analyses have shown the more species you have in a pollinator community, the better pollination you get of a crop. But actually you also want very divergent traits from those pollinators in that community as well. So you want very big ones, very small ones, one's very active in very warm conditions, one's active in very cool conditions, and that gives you better pollination of a crop. So you want very divergent species in that pollinator community. But you also want functional redundancy in that pollinator community. So if you lose one pollinator in that community, you've got another pollinator in that community that has similar traits and carries out a similar function. And you want that high richness, high functional redundancy, high divergence in those pollinator communities for multiple traits as well. So it's kind of an ideal world. What's the ultimate crop pollinator community and what does it look like? Well, it's highly diverse, it's highly species rich, it's highly abundant for many different traits. But that's what you're aiming for, and that's most likely to deliver the best pollination of crops. And we'll talk in the third lecture about how you might achieve that in different production systems, how you might manage systems in a way that allows you to deliver a pollinator community like that. So just as a conclusion, then we've talked about agricultural intensification, reducing pollinator abundance, species richness, and therefore pollination service. And characteristics of that pollinator community in a crop system determine the level of service provided. With species rich and functional diverse pollinator communities providing additional benefits. And it's important to protect those habitats and support that species richness and functionally diverse pollinators in agricultural landscapes, which we'll talk about in the third part of the lecture. Apologies for my cough. I've had a cold recently, so yeah, apologies. So that's the end of that part of the lecture. If you've got any questions about that, then please let us know. Thank you.
Any question? ¿Alguna pregunta? Hay una pregunta. There's a question from Emiliano. And Camila, no, I don't know if se te quedó la mano alzada o tienes otra pregunta.
No, se me quedó la mano alzada, disculpen.
Okay. Emiliano.
Yeah, I have a question, but it was shown on the first class. It was about the exclusion of pollinators in fava bean in that study. And you show us that bumblebees sometimes like steal nectar, but then you show us that in the experiment that only had bumblebees, the yield in fava bean was relatively high. What I'm looking at it wrong, or something happened here?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. So bumblebees will steal nectar from field beans, but not all the time. So they will, if they're foraging specifically for nectar, then they're more likely to land on those flowers and nibble a hole and take nectar from the system. So when we've done surveys in field bean fields, sometimes we see lots of bumblebees raiding nectar, but sometimes we see those bumblebees landing on the flowers and visiting the flowers legitimately to collect pollen. It all depends on what resources they're looking for, and it's a very transient behavior. And actually some species of bumblebee have a particularly long tongue, and they're never recorded raiding nectar. And they will always visit the flower legitimately. So yeah, it's only a temporary behavior. And in our experiments in the flight cages, we use commercial colonies of bumblebees, and actually they're provided with a reservoir of nectar. So I guess their demands are not driven by nectar, and so they choose to visit the flower for nectar and pollen, and therefore carry out that pollination. But yeah, that's an important question. Thanks.
That was very interesting. Thanks.
Any other question?
I have a question.
Amantina, go ahead.
I don't know if we have a study like this, but do we know how the pesticide or fungicide affect to the natural pollinators?
Yeah, there's been lots of research looking at the effects of insecticides on pollinators in general, but most of that research has been carried out on commercial pollinators because the experiments are easier. So there's been lots of work looking at the impacts of insecticides, fungicides and pesticides on honeybees and bumblebees, and some has been done on osmia bees as well. And there's lots of evidence of sublethal and lethal effects of these pesticides affecting their learning, behavior, foraging activity. So there's a lot of evidence showing there's negative effects of these things. And then also evidence showing that sometimes pesticides don't have a negative effect on these species. In terms of wild pollinators, sort of out in the wider environment, there's been less research, but there certainly has been some that shows negative effects on wild pollinators in these systems, and that pesticide load, so the amount of pesticide applied across a landscape, is a factor in determining the abundance and diversity of pollinators in that landscape. But that's more correlative. It's very difficult to carry out a large-scale controlled experiment to measure the effects of pesticides on wild pollinators, but there is some evidence. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any other question?
And I
Tamara.
have a question.
Tamara, go ahead.
Fabiola estaba primero, así que...
Sorry, Fabiola.
Thank you. In the first presentation, in the case of opportunity for improved production in crops, it's okay. But connecting with second presentation, what practice do you think would be the most appropriate to take advantage of this opportunity for improved production in crops throughout pollinators?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I guess that'll be some of the focus of the third talk is how you might address this pollination deficit and take advantage of that opportunity by managing the agroecosystem, so you get a functional pollinator community within that system. And the most appropriate approach will depend on the system in which you're working, but it could involve putting in habitat to increase the certain kinds of wild pollinators. It might involve exploiting managed pollinators in a system to address the pollination deficit, putting more honeybees in, putting bumblebees into a system. But ultimately, it's a combination of different approaches, probably, that's the best to address a pollination deficit. But we see that it varies across different orchards, for example. So the appropriate management to address that deficit is likely different as well between these different orchards, but there is a number of different approaches that could be taken. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Tamara.
Okay, you mentioned two groups of traits, the behavior traits and the physiological traits, and I was wondering if I don't know if important is the word, but my vocabulary is not too wide. And I was wondering if one of these groups it's more important to the visit rate in that.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, there's many different ways of classifying different traits for pollinators. So one example is a physiological trait and a behavioral trait, which can determine how effective they are as pollinators. Which is most important would really depend on the pollinator community and perhaps the crop that you're considering. For some crops, behavioral traits, some key behavioral traits may be the most important thing, whereas for another crop it might be something physiological about the pollinators that really affects how well they pollinate. For example, if we think about beans as an example, probably a really important trait explaining how effective they are as pollinators will be tongue length, because you find those bee species with very long tongues are the ones that most likely visit the flower legitimately and don't raid nectar. So in terms of beans, then a particular physiological trait like tongue length might be the most important. But I think it really depends on the system in which you're considering. And that physiological behavioral trait split is just there for convenience, really. And there's some traits that probably fit into both as well. And then there's also effects traits and response traits, which is another way of grouping traits of species. Effects traits being something about traits about that species that influence the delivery of a service. And then response traits are traits associated with that species that influence how they respond to environmental change and things. Excuse me. So that's effect and response traits, which is another way of splitting up traits. So it's really context dependent, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's do a break right now. Carlos, what time you think are you?
I suggest like 15 minutes. It's fine.
15 minutes, okay. So it's 10:30 here in Chile, so 10:45. It's okay?
Great.
Okay, are you ready, Mike, to continue?
I'll just share screen. If I can find the right presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, can you see that? Okay, great. Yeah. So the third presentation I'm going to give is looking at how we might manage pollinators and pollination as part of ecological intensification. What tools are available? So just to summarize what we've sort of covered, what we learned from the paper that Camilla presented, and also from the slides I was presenting, is that both wild and managed pollinators provide crop pollination services to crops. And these are of significant agronomic and economic value to global agriculture. But pollination deficits do exist in production systems where output could be improved through pollination services. So there are opportunities to improve yield and production through managing pollinators. And also that species-rich and functionally diverse or divergent pollinator communities can deliver improved pollination service, improving yield and production, but also improving the resilience of crop production. And that natural habitats are really important for supporting abundant and diverse pollinator communities in agroecosystems, natural or semi-natural habitats. So now I want to talk about approaches for incorporating into agroecosystems management approaches that can address pollination deficits or could improve crop production resilience through pollination. And just an idea developed by Rufus Isaac and colleagues at Michigan State University. He came up with the term integrated crop pollination, but I think it's a useful one, because we're thinking of pollination as part of ecological intensification, but actually pollination of crops is made up of many factors in itself. And integrated crop pollination is a way of thinking about those different factors to underpin management, informed management of pollination of crops. So it's the use of managed pollinator species in combination with farm management practices to support, augment and protect pollinator populations and provide reliable and economic pollination of crops. And it involves a number of factors. It involves utilizing managed pollinators where necessary, wild pollinators where necessary. It involves managing habitats, but also thinking about agricultural inputs of pesticides and the way crops are grown. In my slides, I guess I'm focusing on a few of these factors, focusing on the managing wild pollinators, utilizing managed pollinators, and primarily through habitat enhancements. But of course, to manage pollination optimally, you need to think of these other factors. There's no point creating habitat for wild pollinators if you're going to apply a pesticide that negatively impacts those wild pollinators and counteracts that habitat management. And of course, the example we gave where we looked at fertilizer and pollination interacting, there's no point in boosting your pollination if your yield is already constrained by soil fertility. So getting your horticultural practices correct as well is important. So it's about thinking about all these factors and how they're interrelated is the most effective way of managing pollination. Now I want to give some examples of different studies that we've done, and some others as well, at managing pollinators in agricultural landscapes. And in terms of supporting wild pollinators through habitat manipulation, there's kind of two key things that wild pollinators need and that aren't necessarily available in an agricultural landscape. And that's somewhere to nest, and then nectar and pollen for them to forage on throughout their active period. Or in some cases, like hoverflies, they need additional forage resources like hosts and things to predate on in order to support them in the agricultural landscape. So it's about nesting and food. So I want to talk about a study we did in the UK as part of a large-scale European project called the Liberation Project. And this project was about studying ecological intensification in production systems across Europe. And we carried out a study as part of this in the UK. And this is an aerial photo of an arable farming landscape in southern England, where we're based at Reading. And you can see it's quite intensive. There's lots of crop fields, and in these crop fields they grow mostly wheat, barley, oilseed rape, beans, but there's very little, well, there's no natural habitat, and there's very little semi-natural habitat, which is part natural. It's not truly natural, but it's not cropped. But what you can see is these lines running through the landscape, and these lines are hedgerows. So these are features of woody plants that are grown as a barrier. So historically, they were set up in the UK to keep livestock apart and to mark the boundary of crop fields. But many of these have been lost in the last 50 or 60 years. But there are still very many across the landscape. In fact, 500,000 kilometres still of hedgerows across the UK landscape. But they may potentially provide a really important habitat for pollinators, but also other beneficial insects like natural enemies. So we did a project to explore their potential. But these hedgerows are all very different from one another. So some are very diverse, and they'll have lots of different woody species, and they're quite big, and they can provide really good nesting habitat for bees and other beneficial insects. But other hedgerows are not so good, and they're heavily cut. They have lots of gaps in them, so gaps between the plant species, and they may not be so good. So we wanted to explore how hedgerow management affects their value for ecological intensification of pollinators. We had a number of objectives. We want to explore the impact of hedgerows on functionally important biodiversity, including pests, natural enemies and pollinators, and how the density and quality of hedgerows affected this, and also how this interacted with local landscape context. So this is where we carried out the experiment in 4 landscape blocks. So this big grey area to the south of these sites is London, and Reading is just a bit to the west. And so these sites were northeast of Reading. Again, it's a relatively intensive arable farming landscape. And we had four landscapes, and within each of these 4 landscapes, we had 4 hedgerow study sites. 2 of these hedgerows were considered good quality hedgerows. They had high species diversity and only a few gaps. And 2 of these hedgerows were considered poorer quality. They were only small, and they had lots of gaps and not many species. And then 2 of those hedgerows were located in a landscape which was very intensive, so dominated by agricultural fields. And 2 of those hedgerows were located in landscapes with more semi-natural habitat, predominantly woodland in that landscape. And these 4 hedgerows were replicated 4 times across the study blocks. And at each study site, we carried out a number of surveys to assess different data. We looked at the abundance of natural enemies in crop fields through pitfall traps. We looked at pollinators by carrying out transects. We also measured hedge quality. We did floral assessments along the hedges. We measured the height of the hedge, the width of the hedge, the number of woody species, to assess how the quality and context of hedgerows affected how important they were as a habitat for beneficial biodiversity. So these data show how the abundance of pollinators on the left and natural enemies on the right are affected, or how their abundance is influenced by the location of a hedgerow at different distances into the field away from the hedgerow. And for both pollinators and natural enemies, we find generally their abundance declines away from the hedgerow, particularly for some groups. So the hedgerows are acting as a kind of source habitat or shelter habitat for beneficial organisms that spill over into crop fields where they may deliver important services of pollination or pest regulation. But we also find that the way a hedgerow is managed also affects how valuable these things are as a habitat. And so those species-rich, large hedgerows are associated with a greater abundance of beneficial insects, whether it's pollinators or natural enemies like spiders, because particularly wild bees were much more abundant on good quality hedgerows. We also considered landscape context. And this is the percentage with it around the hedgerow of non-cropped area, mostly broadleaf woodland. And we found that for some groups were unaffected by this, but for some spiders, namely the lycosid wolf spiders, their abundance was much greater in sites with a lot of woodland associated with them. Their abundance went up as the percentage of woodland was increased. But for pollinators, particularly wild bees, we actually found their abundance decreased on the hedgerows in landscapes where there was a greater cover of non-cropped habitats or woodlands, which is counterintuitive. You think there may be more pollinators in these landscapes, but actually it potentially indicates that these hedgerows that are found in very intensive landscapes surrounded by only crops, there are those pollinators that are in the landscape are drawn to those hedgerows and utilize those hedgerows for forage. So it may be that hedgerows are even more valuable as a pollinator forage resource in very intensive landscapes where there's nothing else to forage on. So we're now working with growers in the UK to adapt the way they manage their hedgerows so that they deliver better value for biodiversity, including pollinators and natural enemies in agricultural landscapes. And it's about filling in hedgerow gaps. It's about increasing the species, the diversity of woody plant species in the hedgerow. And it's about not cutting the hedgerows too often. So this hedgerow is too heavily cut. Actually, you can allow the hedgerow to grow much bigger, and it just needs cutting for regeneration. But you can't solve the problem with just hedgerows. You also need to protect within the landscape those other features which are important source habitats for beneficial organisms. like woodlands. And so it's about a landscape scale management as well as local scale management of hedgerows. I want to give another example of a study which was carried out by the team at Michigan State, and it's a really nice example of a study where they implemented a deliberate management practice in agricultural landscapes to boost pollination in a crop. So in this study, they were working in blueberries, and they put flower plots, very species-rich, diverse flower plots adjacent to blueberry fields, and they measured how these these flower plots affected the activity of pollinators in blueberry crops over a 4-year period. And they found that over 4 years, the abundance of wild bees, particularly in the blueberry crop, increased in fields adjacent to wildflower plots. So it shows that wildflower availability is limiting populations of wild bees, and that if you put these habitats into the landscape, it increases wild bees and actually delivers improved yield in the blueberry crop associated with these flower plots. So it's a really good example of ecological intensification, where you manage habitats to boost yield and production. But importantly, and I think this has implications for ecological intensification more generally, is it takes money, and they looked at the economic outcomes of putting in these flower plots next to blueberries. And of course, it takes money to establish the wildflower plot. And it also means you're not growing blueberries on that plot, you're growing wildflowers instead, which don't have a yield. So there's an initial cost of establishing the flower plot in blueberry plantations. But actually, as you maintain that flower plot, after 3 or 4 years, the improved production that you see in blueberries covers the cost of establishing that wildflower plot for the farmer, although you only see that cost recovered after a significant time, 3 or 4 years. These different lines in the figure show how additional subsidy may be provided by the US government to establish these habitats affects the year at which you start to break even on establishing this kind of habitat. But I think it demonstrates how ecological intensification for yield improvements can often take longer than the more conventional agronomic application to improve yield and production. I want to talk about a third study now where we actually looked at utilizing managed pollinators. So the last 2 examples were habitat for wild pollinators. This was about putting in managed pollinators into a system to look at how it affected pollination. And it was in collaboration with the National Farmers Union, the Sustainable Pollination in Europe project, and the Bee Farmers Association in the UK. I mean, in this experiment, we were working again in oilseed rape fields, and we were working in the west of England on the border with Wales. And we had 9 oilseed rape fields which we were working in. And we put honeybee hives next to these fields of oilseed rape or canola. Some fields we had no honeybees. Some fields we had 10 hives next to the fields, and some fields we had 30 hives next to the fields. And this is an example of these honeybee hives you can see placed next to this oilseed rape field. This is 30 hives here. So there's a lot of bees put into this system. And then we carried out pollinator surveys in the crop. And we carried out transects at different distances into the field and recorded the abundance of different pollinator groups visiting oilseed rape fields in both the control fields and the fields with honeybee hives added to the system. And we also actually measured pollination at each of the red dot locations as well. In each field, we measured the seed set and yield of oilseed rape plants. And this is what we found in terms of pollinator activity. This shows the number of pollinators we saw visiting on each transect. From important groups of pollinators: bumblebees, butterflies, honeybees, hoverflies, other flies, and solitary bees, in fields with, across the bottom, with no hives, 10 hives, or 30 hives. And actually, the pollinator community was quite similar across the different fields, except when and actually honeybees were relatively absent from the landscape there were very few honeybees in fields without honeybee hives. So the ones on the left, which are these red bars. But then when we put honeybee hives adjacent to the fields, we really increased the number of honeybees visiting the crop, and they became the most dominant and the most abundant pollinator in those systems. But when we look at the activity of the 3 most abundant groups of pollinators in these systems at different distances into the field, we look at flies, honeybees, and wild bees here. You can see that their activity in the field is different. And this is data from several rounds of surveys across all 9 fields. And we find that honeybee activity is very low at the edge, but then increases towards the center of the field and then tails off as you get further into the field. They're foraging at an optimal distance away from the hives. Whereas wild bee and flies decline steadily as you get further away from the field edge. But wild bees, their abundance tended to be pretty standard at different distances into the field. And this is demonstrating that there's kind of spatial differences in where these different pollinators forage in the field, and maybe there's complementarity between these different groups of pollinators. Then we look through time. This shows the activity of pollinators at different survey rounds. So round 1 was early flowering, round 2 was peak flowering, and round 3 was late flowering of the canola crop, again of our 3 most abundant groups of pollinators. We found flies were not very abundant relatively at the start of the season, but then their abundance picked up later in the season. Whereas for wild bees, again, it was a bit more steady across the season. Honeybees declined at peak flowering and then increased again, their relative abundance at the end of the season. So again, this is showing some temporal complementarity between these different groups of pollinators. So spatial and temporal complementarity, ensuring potentially better pollination of the crop in different time periods. But interestingly, we found no effects of pollinators on the yield of our oilseed rape crop in these systems. So pollination was no better at the sites with honeybees compared to the sites without honeybees. So this may be because the wild pollinators are doing enough pollination, or it may be because the variety of oilseed rape is not very pollinator dependent, or it may be actually because the yield of these oilseed rape plants is constrained by some other factor, maybe soil fertilizer, and so additional pollination didn't result in increased yield. So again, it shows that we really need to understand the pollination system and understand where there's an opportunity to increase yield before investing in pollinator management to increase that yield. So if the grower spent a lot of money on putting 30 hives next to their oilseed rape field, they would actually find no difference in yield or production. So that's some examples of different management approaches that influence the pollinator communities and pollination within crop systems, whether it's through putting in habitat or utilizing managed pollinators. But in the broader context of ecological intensification, I think there's some broader themes, I think. And what's clear is some broader principles, I think, that can be applied to managing pollinators in agricultural systems. And what's clear is it's protecting and creating natural or semi-natural habitat in agricultural landscapes is fundamental for supporting wild pollinators, and particularly fundamental for supporting high species richness of wild pollinators, which consistently delivers better pollination of crops. But it's also important to implement management at landscape scales. So we've seen examples where the activity of pollinators is affected by landscape context. So if you're deploying habitat management, we need to be thinking at landscape scales, which probably takes the involvement of not just individual farms and farmers, but cooperatives of farmers, or implementing policy that allows for the application and creation of habitat at landscape scales. But it's also important to consider pollination as an agronomic input, like you would fertilizer or water or pesticide. And very often pollination by wild insects is taken for granted as something that's just delivered and is just there. But actually we've shown that this pollination interacts with other management inputs, And so it should start to be thought of more as a management input. Of course, deploying honeybees, everybody who does that sees that as a management input, but actually managing wild pollinators as a management input should be considered more. And another consideration, I think, of managing pollinators as part of ecological intensification is considering those benefits over the longer term. If you're comparing, say, the yield uplift to a crop from applying a nitrogen fertilizer, then you'd see that yield uplift in the season that you apply the fertilizer, and it would be very big. Whereas if you're looking at improving yields through pollination and creating habitats, then maybe you don't see that return on an improvement in yield until year 2, 3, 4, 5. So when reviewing ecologically intensive approaches, it's better to consider them over the longer term, because that's when the benefits really emerge, is after a longer time. And when thinking about conventional intensification or ecological intensification, ecologically intensive approaches like putting in a flower margin to boost pollination also deliver a number of other benefits, such as making the landscape better for people to live in and a place they'd rather be, supporting other biodiversity like butterflies and wildlife, or perhaps improving soil conditions. So it's important to consider these additional benefits that these management approaches take as well. And finally, I know you've had talks, or you are going to get talks about this as well. Is if you're going to make these management approaches work, they need to fit within current management approaches. And so developing them with the land managers and farmers is the best way to ensure success for ecological intensification. And taking an example from our research, we are currently working in apple orchards, and we've been working with growers to put in flower plots and nesting habitats to boost wild pollinators in apple orchards and address those pollination deficits. And those habitat management approaches we co-developed with our growers. So we designed a habitat and a bee nesting intervention that fit within their current management practices. Effectively, we were spraying and extending the herbicide strip under orchards to increase the availability of nesting habitat. And we spoke to the growers about putting floral resources into orchards, and they said they would prefer to manage the understory of the orchards in a certain way, and that actually establishing flower plots adjacent to the orchards was the preferred approach for them. So that's the tool we developed, and we've been measuring the response and the effect of these management practices on apples, and they're delivering benefits. So that's just some of the kind of core ideas around ecological intensification, I think, that are certainly relevant to managing pollinators as well. I'd just like to acknowledge all the institutions and partners and funders who supported the various different research projects I've spoken about, and I'd like to thank Carlos and Juan Luis for inviting me to join this group and present to you guys as well. And I'd be happy to answer any additional questions you may have on that last part of the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, very much for your interesting talk. I don't know if anyone has any question. Yeah, Emiliano, I think.
Yeah, I have a question, and it's mainly about can the flower resources that I introduced to the farm compete somehow with the flower resources of the crop? And another thing that I was trying to answer myself, and I was thinking that maybe they can compete in certain like dates or certain time, but then you're still increasing the biomass of wild pollinators. So on the long term, I think that's good. But what happens when you find that there's competition between those flower resources?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Actually, that's a concern of a lot of growers when you propose to put in flower margins into a crop, particularly apples. They're worried that the pollinators will go to the flower margins instead of the crop itself. And I guess there's two hypotheses that you could test, and one is that there's competition, and that the more flowers you have in the system, pollinators will be drawn away from the crop and will visit the flower margin if they prefer it. Or the other hypothesis is you expect there's facilitation in the system, and actually by bringing pollinators in to visit their flower plot, then they may also be there and also visit the apples too, and it actually increases apple pollination, and that would be at the time of flowering. I mean, the longer term benefits of increasing the abundance and biomass of pollinators in the system is likely to deliver improved pollination, but it's that question of competition and facilitation when the apples are in flower. And we've explored that in our study, and we found no evidence of competition between the flower plots and the apples. And we actually find that we get greater visitation of wild bees and bumblebees in apples at sites with flower plots that are co-flowering. And we find this happens even in the first year of the study, when we might expect that we wouldn't see population level effects at that time. But in real time, in that first season, we saw uplifts of pollinators. So we don't think that there's competition happening, and we think it's more likely facilitation. But again, that kind of thing would be completely context dependent. And there is studies that have shown that some pollinator species, including honeybees, have been drawn off apples to visit co-flowering oilseed rape. So there's competition happening there. So certainly there is the potential for competition to exist between floral resources drawing pollinators away, but we haven't seen it in our study. And I know there's a number of studies that have explored this. Some have maybe found some haven't. So I think it's context dependent, but an interesting thing to be tested.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I have another question. I hope this is quicker. In Chile, we have a lot of wild bees that their nesting habitat is the soil. Do you have those, and what are the management that you can do to increase their services?
Yeah, we certainly do. So probably the most important wild pollinator of apples in our systems are andrenid bees, and they're ground nesting bees. And we find, but also lasioglossums, we find nesting in orchards. So as one study, we find them mostly, their nesting density is greater in bare ground patches. So we actually sprayed areas within the orchard to create patches of bare ground to encourage nesting of ground nesting bees. Over the 3 years of the study, we've got a paper coming out imminently, but over the 3 years of the study, we did find nesting increased in these extended areas. But actually, we think most of the bees that nested in these extended spray areas were lasioglossums, and maybe not the andrenid bees that pollinate the apples. And actually, more recently, we've done some work. We found these andrenid bees are probably nesting more often than not in vegetation at the base of hedgerows and undisturbed areas of land adjacent to the orchards. So now we're thinking that actually, if you want to increase nesting opportunities for apple pollinators, actually these edges of the orchards underneath hedgerows are potentially more important than necessarily bare ground in the orchards themselves. But I think it depends on the species that are important in your system. But inevitably, disturbing the ground, ploughing, turning the soil is no good for ground nesting bees. So keeping those areas of undisturbed soil is really important.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Mike, I have a question. Usually, the effect of spillover of wild insects to the crop is limited by the distance from floral edges or bands. What do you think that we need? Because it's usually a question from farmers. So we need to put bands every distance, or what are your experience to recommend farmers about this question that usually when you ask in workshop, when you discuss with farmers about the importance of floral margins, they and you show data that is limited by the distance, is a question that all the time arise among them. So
it's a good question. Obviously depends on species and their foraging distances from the habitats. I think we don't have a good handle on that in UK apple orchards, but I think that's because actually they're really quite small compared to I don't know, avocado plantations that you work in, and certainly compared to apple orchards that we might find in France, Germany or Spain. They are always much bigger than UK orchards. So from a UK perspective, we've had study plots in our orchards, but they're only relatively small, 50 meters by 40 meters. And that's our study plot, but the orchard is only 100 meters by 50 meters or something like that. So these benefits we detect in our study plots. So I don't think there's such a limitation in terms of spillover in our production systems, but that's because the orchards are small. It would be really interesting to explore this in much larger apple orchards and really see how a floral intervention, or how the effects of that spill over into those orchards, because I think, yeah, 200 meters, 300 meters, 400 meters away from some natural area, I think you would see much drop off, but we don't have those locations in UK apple orchards. Yeah.
Okay, well, probably next year we will have some information about that.
Yeah.
I hope so. Okay.
In apples as well as avocado.
Yeah,
in
apple.
apples. Yeah,
in apple and sweet cherries also.
Yeah.
And avocado with the results of Kira. Yeah. So there's Claudia, I think, has another question, and Pascal asked also a question in the chat. He said that I think it must be difficult to understand which plant species or which particular habitat should be favored to improve pollination. Are there examples of implementation of a specific natural habitat to favor a particular group of pollinators that are known to affect pollination in a good way?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the right plants to put in to a flower margin, for example, it has big implications on the cost of establishing that flower margin and how to manage that flower margin as well. So in the ones we put in orchards, we had quite a diverse mix of species. I think we maybe had 12 or 15 flowering plant species, and a proportion of those, or maybe it's even closer to 20, and a proportion of those were annual, so they would flower in the first season. So we had a plot of annual flowering plants and then another plot of perennial flowering plants, which then flowered and dominated the flower plot in subsequent seasons. And we went for a diversity of flowering plant species. So actually they were in flower from very early season to very late season. We were looking for that temporal cover of flowers. But definitely there is what plants you establish in a flower plot will definitely have implications for the value of that flower plot for pollinators or other biodiversity like natural enemies. And I know there was an interesting study done by Alistair Campbell in apple orchards, and he had different kinds of flower margins set up in apple orchards, and he found that they supported different groups of beneficial insects. And I think having lots of, if I remember rightly, but you could look at the study, it's Campbell, I think he published it in 2017, having lots of open flowers like umbelliferas, I think, was really beneficial for hoverflies, because they need open flowers to forage on, whereas some of the other more specialized flowers, maybe like clovers, are utilized by bumblebees and other bees. So I think you can tailor your mix of flowers in a flower plot to target different parts of the biodiversity, whether it's pollinators, whether it's natural enemies. So considering the morphology of the flowers, but also when they're in flower too, and whether it's complementary to the crop. But I think that would have a big influence on how successful they might be. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question?
Yo tengo un comentario.
Go ahead.
Pero en español.
Okay, no problem.
Es que el otro día revisaba un documento en la revista Nature y hablaban justamente de esto de la pérdida en la abundancia y el número de especies de polinizadores. Pero ellos además cruzaban estos datos con el tema del cambio climático. Entonces, un poco como conclusión, además de todas las prácticas o medidas que podemos tomar para favorecer el desarrollo de los polinizadores, ellos indicaban que es súper importante también que tomemos prácticas para, mucho más macro, sí, pero para detener el cambio climático, porque por ejemplo, en ambientes donde no estaban intervenidos por la agricultura, solo por el factor cambio climático, la abundancia de las especies se reducía entre un 5 y un 7%. Y en la medida que las prácticas de agricultura se iban intensificando, tenían así como agricultura con baja intensidad hasta alta intensidad, el factor cambio climático también se iba intensificando, ¿entienden? O sea, si medían solo la pérdida en la abundancia de especies en la agricultura intensiva, con alta intensidad, decían ellos, había, o sea, un 40% de pérdida de especies, pero si cruzabas esto con los factores del cambio climático, había un 60%, incluso en algunos lugares del mundo hasta un 70%.
Okay, Mike, Fabiola has a comment of this recent paper in Nature of the Decline of Insect, Tim Newbold, and she was comment about the effects, the combined effect of agricultural management and also climate change. That is a war, is more than a local effect. So she has a comment about if we change management, even if we change the management for environmental management, we will lose species from climate effect of climate change. But in this paper, Fabiola, one of the conclusions of this paper is very interesting for agriculture because it's reinforced the importance of maintain natural areas in the surrounding area of agriculture. They said that farms that are with more than 70% of the 75, I think, % of the vegetation in the surrounding area is native or semi-natural. The reduction is less than in more intense areas. So I think that one of the message of the paper is to conserve these remnant areas and protect and restore also to increase the heterogeneity of the landscape that will be a kind of more resilient. The landscape will be more resilient to climate change than other. And there's other, this is a paper with the focus of insect, but there's a couple of other papers that show that in areas where you conserve or protect natural areas in general are more resilient to the effect of climate change than areas that are more intense by agriculture. So we should change the lens to include the protection of remaining natural area or restore degraded one, because it's also improving for the provision of ecosystem service to agriculture and also improve the resilience to climate change. I think that this is one of the messages of this paper. I don't know if Mike has another comment of this research.
Yeah, no, I hadn't had a chance to look at it in detail, but yeah, it was just worrying the cover of, it was only at very high covers of natural areas or non-agriculture, I suppose, natural areas where this beneficial effect was seen, which is rather worrying, I suppose, because that is a high proportion. So how many landscapes could you try and protect? 75% of natural habitat would be quite difficult. So that's kind of alarming, but I suspect that's an artifact of where the data's collected from and things like that. So the general principle may hold, as you've said, Juan Luis, that generally it's beneficial, including in terms of climate resilience, to protect these non-cropped habitats.
Yeah, this a typical question is, and there's different paper, how much area we need to conserve, which percentage? And it's usually a question that farmers and other stakeholders ask, which is the number? They need a number to how much we improve production and also resilience to climate change, and also to improve the provision of ecosystem service. I think that there's no magic number, but it's depend the context. But yeah, there's some research that has deal with, for example, there's a paper of Garibaldi that said that 20% of the landscape need to be protected, remaining natural areas. So, but it's
There was another one, Lindix, I think, estimated 5%, I think, of florally rich habitat to support pollinators, but using kind of different approaches. I guess it must be very context dependent. Again, what's the right answer? And the short answer will be as much as possible, I suspect, but that's nobody wants to hear that.
Yeah, I'm agreed too. Yeah. So I don't know if there's another question of, I think that Amantina probably, or I'm wrong, and Carlos also.
Yes. Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
Thanks, Mike, first of all, for your presentation. I think it was very interesting topic and experiences. My question is, I want to do a question regarding more with political arena somehow. I would like to know whether you can share with us information on United Kingdom experience. Do they have some kind of policy in order to improve the willingness of farmers to adopt, for example, more sustainable practices to of course, protected pollinator animals in general? I mean, some kind of economic mechanism or some kind of local policy in order to motivate the farmers in order to implement this kind of sustainable practices. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. They do in the UK. So we've just left Europe, well, 3 or 4 years ago, which was a bad decision if you ask me, but we left Europe. But prior to that, we were part of the Common Agricultural Policy, where European government funded farmers directly for putting in or putting in habitats or farming in a way that minimized negative environmental impacts or created habitats on farms. So there was direct subsidy provided to farmers or stewardship schemes to pay them to put in habitats or farm in a certain way. So definitely there was economic incentives there. Since we've left the EU, the UK is now developing its own policy for stewardship to support farmers and land managers to put in habitats, protect habitats, put in new habitats or farm in a certain way. And yeah, so there's direct economic incentives there because of the wider public goods and services that farming in this way delivers beyond potentially improving the farmer's bottom line. Generally, a lot of these things won't make economic sense in most places. So then you need that additional economic incentive, I think, for the good that it'll provide. But the model for the way they implement that in the UK is changing. So before they used to just ask a farmer to put in a flower plot and give them X pounds or dollars, whatever, for the amount that they put in. But now they're asking land managers to sort of almost come together and design their own agri-environment scheme or stewardship scheme and say, we'd like to do this, this, and this, and to apply for them funding. And they say, we're going to do this, this, and this, and then they apply for that funding and get given that funding. So they're trying to make it be led by the farmers and land managers rather than just being told what to do. And they're hoping that this will make the schemes more successful and will make them kind of work better in different areas of the UK rather than just having one scheme that kind of is rolled out across the UK. They're hoping this will make the schemes better for different regions. And also now they are exploring ideas of the amount of money that a farmer will receive for implementing a habitat management strategy will be based on how good that habitat is. So before they used to say you just need to put in 100 square meters of flower plot and you get £2,000. But now they're going to start basing the amount of money that the farmer or land manager receives on the quality of that habitat. But this is all in transition at the moment, and it's technically very difficult to make this kind of policy work. And there's a lot of good things and bad things about it. But I think this can't work without additional financial incentives driven by policy, because it needs to happen quickly and it doesn't always pay off for the farmer to carry out these kind of practices. It needs that additional support, I think.
Thanks, Mike.
¿Alguna otra consulta, pregunta, comentario?
I mean, I have a question. I mean, in Chile, for example, is there a similar political or policy incentive for growers to employ ecologically intensive practices or protect habitats?
No,
we have for example, the SEERS, but it's based on soil restoration mainly.
Yeah,
they have a list of practices that the state subsidize, and some of them somehow, for example, may have a potential impact on pollinators or that kind of issue. For example, there is one, I remember one practice that is related with a green, let's say, a green vegetation in order to avoid, for example, the flow of water across the soils. So they use green barriers like that.
Yeah.
And somehow that kind of barrier also flowering also serve as a small habitat, let's say, to some kind of pollinator, but specifically on this kind of growing some kind of maintaining some areas. In this moment, I don't think so. Maybe some of the other.
No, but there's some subsides and the origin is different. No, it's not environment. It's just to recover soils, for example, and enhance. Some of them has a negative result. For example, it's subsidize the drain of soils near wetlands to improve the soil surface for agriculture. So they drain some wetlands, for example. But last year, it was a meeting to discuss this kind of subsides, mainly to the soil, to include more environmental approach. But I participate in a kind of workshop, and I think at Carlos also under the framework of the deans of agriculture that has they organized this meeting with the Minister of Agriculture. But I don't know if it's for this work finishing yet. So
there exists also the native forest law.
Yeah,
that give subsidies to the owners in order to implement a good forest management, native management. So somehow that also serves as a improve the habitat for animal pollinators, I think. Yeah.
And the other, we have in the Congress the law, a law of soil that, but it's the focus. It has a environmental issue to protect soil, but it's not approved right now. But it's almost in a good way. So I hope that in the next year we will have a soil protection law. But yeah, more than the environmental impact assessment that many, not particularly for agriculture, is for forestry or any other industries. There's no a management in order to benefit like
biodiversity.
Biodiversity or environment or ecological intensification practice to agriculture. Yeah. There's Samantina and Tamara.
Tamara estaba primero.
Tamara.
I have a really quick question about the efficacy of these bees hotels, and there's evidence about how useful they are?
Yeah, so there's a lot of studies that put bee hotels into production systems to provide additional nesting resources for certain species of bee that use these bee hotels. I think they've been used in alfalfa by a certain leafcutter bee, perhaps, that in alfalfa maybe, and they've been used to increase their populations, perhaps. I have a feeling I read a paper on that maybe, but I could be wrong. Otherwise, I don't know of any other direct evidence that they are beneficial. But I'm sure they would be if nesting habitat were a key constraint on particular species that were important pollinators. Then by introducing more of that nesting habitat, then you think it might work to increase pollinators and pollination. But I can't think of any examples, I'm afraid, but there probably are some.
Thank you.
I have a commentary about public policy in Chile, and we have a policy that regards when you increase the landscape with crops. El subsidio de riego. ¿Cómo se dice riego? No sé.
Irrigation subsidy.
We have irrigation subsidy to regards the agriculture, and that is a big problem because we have a lot of agricultures that take off all the forest and put in avocado or another crops, and this is subsidized by the state, so it's bad for environmental.
Yeah, but Amantina, I have a different point of view, because it's not the subsidized of the irrigation subsidize the problem. Is that the forest law permitted not anymore to replace natural forest by agriculture. That's the problem, not the subsidy of irrigation. It was an interpretation that the forest law permit the replacement with agriculture for particularly in hills, but this interpretation was not allowed anymore until the government make an adjustment in the law in 2020, last year, so, or 2021, but recently. So it's not anymore allowed to replace native forests by agriculture. Okay, there's any other question?
Yo quiero hacer un comentario. Lo voy a hacer en español, sí, así que feliz si me pueden traducir. Bueno, yo creo que la misión más importante que tenemos ahora es como rediseñar nuestros sistemas de agricultura convencionales en agroecosistemas, y que eso va a dar un pie a atraer más polinizadores, a como regenerar, mitigar un poco el cambio climático. Pero igual concuerdo un poco con lo que decía antes la persona que estaba hablando, que no recuerdo el nombre, y siento que Chile igual está tomando un poco de ventajas frente a o como aprovechándose un poco como del cambio climático. Por ejemplo, las viñas como el clima está cambiando, las proyecciones de algunos cultivos de frutales o de viñas de vino, etcétera, están haciendo sus proyecciones hacia el sur, donde sí van a ocupar áreas que están más pristinas, como hoy en día. Y ahí está como la gran misión de ir rediseñando todos estos sistemas más convencionales al final. Y como que igual se están subsidiando o apoyando como este como estas proyecciones hacia el sur de Chile, la Patagonia, por ejemplo, etc. Eso.
She has a comment about the projection of climate change, that the availability to produce some crops is moving forward south because central and north of Chile is going more dry and hot. So the crops, it's moving further south where we have more natural areas, and will be a conflict between the expansion of agriculture and the protection of natural areas in the south central of Chile.
That's interesting to hear. I mean, where again the UK, I think by comparison, is every I don't know, every square inch is managed, and there's very little sort of natural area where agriculture can expand just at capacity in the UK. But I guess it's a slightly different situation in Chile. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if someone, Mariela has a question also. And I think that we should finish after Mariela questions.
Es que tengo.
Okay. Mariela.
Sí. Profe, era más bien por por el enlace que usted pasó en la clase, que habla justamente sobre los problemas que hoy en día afectan en Europa relacionados con el tema de las abejas, y hacen solamente alusión a la mano de obra, que es lo que pasa, que no es remunerado bien a los apicultores hoy en día.
Okay, Mike, when you were talking about the decline of insects, of pollinators in the UK, and someone asked a question about what about honeybee, managed honeybee, I shared in the chat, I shared the paper of Simon Potts about the reduction of honey of beekeepers in Europe. But in this paper, the conclusion is more associated with social problems, people who work and other economic stuff. And Mariela wanted and asked me also, what about the problem of other, for example, agriculture management, like the use of pesticide or other agrochemicals that could affect. And I think I'm not if you share, but I think that it's different when we are talking about a managed species that we reproduce, we maintain, and depends on the needs of this species market and anything. When we are talking of wild species that are has their own dynamic related more with climate and the habitat. So probably it's a huge difference to compare the dynamic of a wild species to the managed species. But I don't know if Mike could.
I agree with you. I think the challenges and solutions are probably quite different. Of course, there is evidence that pesticides negatively affect honeybees and expose them, but I think the challenge and solution are quite different. Certainly in the UK, where every hive is managed, so there's no wild honeybees. If you want to increase honeybees, then it's about supporting beekeepers and beekeeping infrastructure. I think, as opposed to wild pollinators, which would be different approaches. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And the last question, Hector, and we will finish because we are over on the time, so it's too late. Okay. But Hector also is in Germany, so okay.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I want to ask about the preference of the pollinators with some crops you told today. It's just a question related that with the landscape modifications. So I don't know if there is a kind of the preference or dependency with these crops. So have you seen the behavior of these pollinators in abandoned orchards? I don't know if it's
Sorry,
clear or not.
in which orchards?
Yeah. For instance, you show us some preference of pollinators to some crops. So I don't know if this is a dependency right now of these crops, or what is the behavior of the pollinators if there is a modification on the landscape and there is now some abandoned orchard or something like this.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, we look at different crops and we see different pollinator communities in those crops, and the reason for that is different pollinators can forage in different ways, and I guess they're active at different times, and they forage different distances, and so that I think that's what determines the pollinator community you find in a crop. But certainly some pollinators prefer some crops than others. And there's been quite a lot of research, particularly looking at canola or oilseed rape, because it's such a big floral resource in the landscape, that they found that when in areas where there's lots of oilseed rape, for example, you get less good pollination of strawberries in adjacent crops because the pollinators are attracted to the canola, and so you get less pollination of the strawberries. And this operates at a landscape scale. So it's an important consideration, I think, and it's probably what determines pollinator communities you find in crops. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, the preferences for crops constrained by the foraging capacity of pollinators is what determines the pollinators you find in different crops.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if it's my idea was or my question was related with as you told us also in the UK you have a lot of modification on the landscape. So I don't know if the pollinators has a kind of adaptation to this landscape modification. So for that, I don't know if this preference is a real preference or is a kind of dependency of the crops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting as well, and there have been other studies that show in landscapes with lots of canola or oilseed rape populations do better, and then also that those it's actually only a subset of these pollinator community that persist in these agricultural landscapes, and some actually do very well in these agricultural landscapes. And I think the community of pollinators we find in crops in the UK is probably very different to what it might have been in the past, and I think that the community of pollinators has changed a lot, but that's still, but we do still see that richness and diversity go up with semi-natural areas in those landscapes, even within the UK landscape, which doesn't vary very much. I mean, it's all very relatively intensive and relatively managed, but we still see that pattern in the communities that we find. But yeah, certainly they're far from being anything close to what a natural community is, and they're probably very reliant on crops and the pollen and nectar provided by crops. And actually now neonicotinoids have been banned from use on canola. There's much less canola being grown in the UK, and a lot of people are worried that maybe that will reduce the amount of pollen and nectar available to bees and other pollinators relying on it in the landscape. So it'll be interesting to see whether that has a big negative effect, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so thank you, Mike, for all your interesting talk. As usually, a lot of information, very helpful for the student, for us also, and for your interest to collaborate with us in this course.